a few minutes can't do more than prime the pump. But let me tell you what I propose to do. I want to make 4 preliminary comments just to set the stage, and then briefly sketch 5 distinctive elements in Christian understanding that set the framework in which Christians think about these things usefully. Okay? And so this is not a justification of the ways of God to human beings or anything like that. It's merely a sketch of the things that shape our learning and thinking in these regards. Number 1, still preliminary. If you live long enough, you will suffer. We sometimes forget that, but it needs to be said. If you live long enough, you'll be bereaved. The only alternative to that is bereaving somebody else. If you live long enough, you'll have cancer or Alzheimer's or both. If you live long enough, you'll lose a job, lose a relationship. Suffering is endemic to the human condition. Number 2, scale up. If you live long enough, you will see catastrophic suffering, either personally or through the media. There are wars, tsunamis, famines, plagues. So whether you're talking about a tsunami in East Asia, or you're talking about millions dying from AIDS in Africa, or you're talking about starvation in the Sahel and Point South, or you're talking about violence in many parts of the world from many causes. If you live long enough, you'll see massive scale suffering. And in some ways, one of the things that's surprising is that we don't think more about such matters until they afflict us. Most people tend to think most deeply about these matters only when they themselves suffer. So I can't help but commend you for being here and thinking about these things, giving some time to think about it, when I suspect most of you are not currently suffering a great deal. Number 3, every worldview, every religion, every ideology, without exception, has to develop some kind of framework somewhere for thinking about these things. This is not the Christian problem. It's a human problem. So if, for example, you are a philosophical materialist, that is, you believe that all that is matter and energy and space-time, that's all there is, then you have some challenges when you start thinking about suffering and evil too. Because at the end of the day, it's hard to build moral indignation when all that happens is nothing more than quarks banging into each other and living half-lives of nanoseconds and the like. It nevertheless goes against our whole instinct to say this isn't a moral issue. It's just chance. It's stuff happens. Things bang together and people suffer. And people face pain. When your whole instinct is to say this isn't fair, or what is going on here? Do you see? So in my experience, at least, with friends of mine who are philosophical materialists, they grin wryly and admit that their human instinct, when they face personal suffering, is different from what their perception of the universe is all about. The one says, this isn't right, there's something wrong here, and the other says, it's just stuff happening. All I'm saying is that all of us face questions and serious challenges in mental order when you think about these things, no matter what ideology you come from. Finally, the Bible itself doesn't duck these questions. It's not as if the Bible is a Pollyannish book where everything is sweet and lovely. The book of Job, for example, a larger book in the Old Testament, the part of the Bible that was written before the coming of Christ, its whole question revolves around innocent suffering. There's another smaller prophecy written by a chap called Habakkuk, and his question is a more focused form of the same broader challenge. He can understand how God might use war to chasten a nation. He can understand that, he says. What he can understand is how God can use a stronger, more publicly despicable, arrogant, violent nation to chasten a nation which, relatively, is not nearly so wicked. He can't understand that at all. It doesn't seem fair. And that's what the book of Habakkuk is about. Moreover, even with respect to Jesus himself, his own disciples, as Jesus was eventually heading to the cross, his own disciples had no category for a crucified Messiah. Messiahs win. They have to have happy endings. They're strong. They're powerful. So for Jesus to go to a cross and become, apparently, a victim and be tortured and die, that just doesn't make much sense. They had no category for it. So once he is in the tomb and buried, they're not confidently saying, yes, I can hardly wait to the third day when he is expected to rise from the dead. They weren't thinking in such categories. They were facing problems of suffering at a personal, experiential level as well. In other words, the questions of suffering keep showing up again and again and again. All right, that's the sketch of the preliminaries to get out of the way to set the stage. So now 5 distinctive Christian positions that are worth holding in mind as you try to argue these things out. From my perspective as a Christian, these things are non-negotiable, they're fundamental. Number 1, a distinctive view of God. The Bible insists that God is sovereign and good and personal. Now, he's a lot more, but at least those 3. Sovereign and good and personal. So let me give a couple of illustrations to show you what I mean, coming out of narrative sections. In the first book of the Bible, the book called Genesis, in the last chapter, it's chapter 50, there's a rather interesting scene. It's almost a throwaway scene, but it's quite telling. There's a man called Joseph. He was the 11th of 12 brothers, and he was sold by 10 of those brothers into slavery. They wanted to get rid of him for various reasons, and as a result, he spent years in slavery in brutal conditions and rose through the ranks of slaves, and then through some remarkable events, he eventually became Prime Minister of Egypt. And because of the power that he had on that level, he eventually saved his brothers and family, his extended family, from starvation. And now the old man, the father, has just died, a chap by the name of Jacob. And the 10 brothers are afraid that Joseph now will wreak his vengeance upon the 10 because the old man is not there to restrain him anymore. And Joseph is a bit hurt by this fear and trembling before him. And as he works it out with the brothers and explains things, one of the things he says is this. He says, when you sold me into slavery, you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. Now that's really interesting language. It's not. Unfortunately, God was asleep at the switch that day. He was taking a walk in Hyde Park, exercising perhaps. So he didn't notice what you were doing when you intended your mischief. But fortunately, he's an excellent chess player, and he came along and moved some pieces around, and eventually it had a happy ending. That's not what it says. Nor does it say, God's intention was to see to it that I was driven down to Egypt in an air-conditioned, chauffeur-driven limousine. But unfortunately, you guys came along and mucked it up, and I went down as a slave instead. Sorry about that. Rather, in one and the same event, Joseph reasons, your intentions were evil, and God's intentions were good. Now, there are scores and scores and scores of narratives and passages of one sort or another where that sort of tension exists. In other words, God is not pictured as a robotic sovereign so that somehow the brother's evil is diluted or mitigated or somehow misplaced because God required them to do something. Or rather, they are actors and they have evil intentions in this particular set of actions. And God is an actor, and he has intentions, and they're good. And you're left with some tensions in your mind about how you think about such a God. Scores and scores. I don't have the time to detail more of them, but I'll mention one briefly. If you want to read some really dramatic ones, take a look at a prophet who's writing more than 700 years before Jesus by the name of Isaiah, chapter 10, verses 5 and following. That's a really scary one. but I won't detail it here. I don't have time. Even with respect to Jesus' own death, however, when his followers start reasoning through what happened after the event, after Jesus has died and has risen, and now they're beginning to face some opposition and persecution from the religious authorities around them, they get together and have a prayer meeting. And in their prayer, they say words to this effect. You can find them for yourself in the New Testament part of the Bible, the part that's written after Jesus' death and resurrection, in a book called Acts, chapter 4, verses 27 and 28. And there they address God, and they say, indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate and the rulers of the Jews conspired together against your holy servant Jesus. In other words, the reason Jesus went to the cross, the reason he was executed, the reason he was tortured, the reason he was beaten, was because of a two-bit political conspiracy in a small country at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Period. That's what the text says. Next verse. They did what your hand determined beforehand should be done. So on the one hand, Jesus went to the cross because he was the victim of a cheap conspiracy, kangaroo court. On the other hand, he went because God had ordained that he go to the cross. That is, he went not as the victim of bad politics, but he went as God's designed sacrifice for the sins of others. In one and the same event, malice on the part of human beings trying to bump Jesus off, and a loving, intentional sacrifice on the part of God for the sake of others. Now, I don't pretend for a moment that it's easy to think through how God is sovereign, good, and personal. On the other hand, when David Hume and others say the problem of evil is simple, if God is sovereign and he allows suffering, then he's not good. If God is good and he tries to stop suffering but can't, he's not sovereign. That's the classic form in which David Hume cast the dilemma. But the Bible rules out that way of thinking to begin with, because God is presented as good and sovereign and personal right from the very beginning, in scene after scene after scene, in different genres of literature across a period of 1,500 years of writing and so on and so on. That's the given. Now, how to think through how that given works out. If this were another sort of lecture, we could talk about compatibilism, and we could talk about the relationship of God to time and eternity and all kinds of things, and wonder if there are some threads toward some kind of acceptable resolution on those fronts without just flat-out contradiction. Fine. We don't have time to do any of that. All I'm saying is the given from the Bible is a certain view of God to begin with. That's baseline on which you start to build from there. Number two, a certain view of evil. There's an interesting story in the Old Testament, a king who lived about 1000 BC. Seduces a young woman next door at a time when this young woman's husband is on the military front fighting the king's wars. The woman becomes pregnant. She lets the king know, and the king eventually arranges to have her husband bumped off. So he's committed adultery and murder. And the way he gets the man bumped off is by arranging a military skirmish where the guy was going to lose his life. So he's corrupted the military high command as well. Eventually he's caught out, he's found out, and he is eventually brought to real shame and repentance, aware of his guilt. And he writes a really moving psalm addressed to God. In our Bibles, it's Psalm 51. And part of what he says, now praying to God, is, "Against you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight." And you read that, and the first instinct is to say, come on, David, you've got to be joking. Against you only have I sinned? Surely you sinned against the young woman. You seduced her. You sinned against her husband. You had him bumped off. You sinned against the military high command. You corroded them, corrupted them. You sinned against your own family. You betrayed them. As the chief magistrate for the nation, you sinned against the whole nation by betraying your covenanted position. It's hard to think of anybody that you didn't sin against. And you have the cheek to say, against you only have I sinned? And yet, in the Bible, his statement makes a certain sense. At one level, it's the most profound thing that he says. Because what makes sin, evil, so sinful, from the Bible's perspective, is that it's an offense against God. That is, most of us think of any offenses that we may commit as being horizontal. We've hurt somebody's feelings, or we've stolen some money, or whatever. All of them horizontal relationships. But if the first and most fundamental command is to love God with heart and soul and mind and strength, then the first and most fundamental sin is not to love God with heart and soul and mind and strength. And indeed, it's the sin that everybody always commits, without exception. They commit any other sin. If you cheat the Income Revenue Service here of owed taxes, the most offended party is God. If you nurture arrogance and bitterness, the most offended party is God. You cheat on your spouse, the most offended party is God. And so on, so on, so on. That's the framework in which the Bible reckons sin. That means that although we need proper relationships with one another and need reconciliation and all of that, what we also need is to be reconciled to God. That's the drama of the Bible storyline. And so much of the suffering in the world is either the direct result of this defiance of God, or indirectly the cause of a world order that is itself lost in rebellion against God and attracting the just judgment of God upon it. That's part of the Bible storyline. So that when we're thinking about what God is doing in Aleppo, there is a sense in which there is an anterior view of evil that is bigger than that. It's set within a framework of something larger. Wars and rumors of wars, God predicts, are going to happen in a world that is damned. That is, it chooses violence on so many fronts. People loving power and loving authority, loving money, loving to put others down so that they can be built up. It's not something that is endemic to one race or one religion. It's part of the human condition. And it's painfully ugly and hurtful. Number three. The last three I'll mention more quickly. So a distinctive view of God, a distinctive view of evil, a distinctive view of where we're going. In other words, when we do a calculus about whether something or not is fair, it's usually on a very small scale, whether it's fair in this life. Some people get through life with remarkably good health, and then at the age of 83 they have a heart attack and die peacefully in their beds at night. And how does that square with somebody who has contracted because of the genetics that they inherited through no fault of their own, Huntington's chorea? How is one fair over against another one, and so on? Yet the Bible does insist in pretty strong terms and repeatedly, and the farther on in the Bible you get, the louder this perspective sounds, that there is life beyond this grave, and in the end, not only will justice be done, but it will be seen to be done. And that means that there is an element of faith in trusting this God to right things at the end. Now, it's not blind faith, but that is part of the structure of reality that the Bible insists upon. That's why a man who suffers like Job and realizes that things aren't fair and raises some questions to God can still address God and say, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Number 4. a distinctive view of the kind of Savior that God has provided. If the fundamental problem of humankind is economics, then surely we need a great economist. If the fundamental problem of human beings is illness, then we need a great doctor. If the fundamental problem of human beings is bad administration, then we need excellent administration. But if the most fundamental problem of human beings, related to the Bible's view of what real evil consists in, is defiance of God, it's not loving God with heart and soul and mind and strength, not loving our neighbors as ourselves. If it's bound up with all the sins and social evils and catastrophes that we attract because of these things, then what we need is someone to deal with our sin. And here religions say quite different things. In some cases, it is taught that basically you're acceptable before God if you try hard enough and your good stuff balances out the bad stuff, so that God tilts the scales and you're finally acceptable or not acceptable on that basis of personal merit before God on the last day. But the Bible has a different way of looking at things. It says, in effect, that the good stuff can't outdo the bad stuff, because we're supposed to do the good stuff anyway. Jesus goes so far as to say human beings are, at the end of the day, all unprofitable servants. Which means the only way that God is going to deal with us in a transforming way is out of sheer grace. Either that, or we're lost. And so, in the Bible's presentation of the solution, what God does is He comes to us Himself in the person of His Son. Now that raises a whole lot of new questions about how Jesus is related to His Father. That's another talk. But He comes to us in the person of His Son and bears our own guilt and its penalty in His own body in death. And on the basis of such, what else to call it? Substitution. On the basis of such love, forgives us. So that the beginning of the Christian way is receiving in gratitude and faith this gift from God that Christ has won for us. And God, for His part, starts transforming us inwardly, changing us from within. That's the language that Jesus uses about new birth and about the work of the Spirit in our own lives. For those of you who have been following this series of talks, we dealt a bit with that last night at the larger meeting at All Souls. I'm sure it was taped. You can listen to it again if you want to. And finally, a distinctive view of the role of Christian suffering. Now, at the beginning, we said we began with the fact that everybody suffers. And most of us think that suffering isn't much fun. But most of us will acknowledge that sometimes when we've been through some suffering, it shapes us positively in some ways. Some forms of suffering do. Some things make us bitter, not better. Or some things make us bitter first and then better. Some things just destroy us. But beyond all of those sort of psychological awarenesses of how suffering in a broken world can turn out for good, there's another distinctively Christian element to suffering that's worth mentioning before we open it up to questions. And that's this. There is a sense in which Jesus also calls His followers to follow Him in this regard. There's a remarkable passage where Paul writes to a group of young Christians in the first century living in the city of Philippi. And he says, "To this you have been called. It has been granted to you not only to believe on His name, but also to suffer for His sake." Do you hear that? It's been granted to you, a gift. It's been granted you to believe on His name and also to suffer for His sake. As if it's a privilege. It's a privilege to have the kind of faith that trusts Jesus, and it's a privilege actually to suffer for Jesus. In other words, Jesus went this way, and Jesus has the gall to tell His followers, "And now you must take up your cross and follow me too." It's mostly metaphorical, but it's still quite stunning, isn't it? And when the first followers of Jesus, the apostles, were beaten up for the first time because they were Christians, the text says. You can find it in Acts chapter 5, verse 41. The text actually says that the apostles rejoiced because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. So the last thing you want is Christians feeling sorry for themselves because they face a bit of opposition now and then. In other words, they want to align with Christ and remember his words, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. Rejoice and be glad, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You align with a certain group of people who have wanted righteousness and following God and his way, following Christ and his example more than they wanted anything else in the whole world.